Today's presentation is going to be about the fluid compartments of the body and the importance that these fluids hold in the homeostasis of controlling our bodily fluids. We're going to look at a couple different compartments and the importance they each hold and the different functions that they serve into maintaining homeostasis within our bodies. To begin today, I'm first going to talk about the two major components of fluid compartments in the body, and these are the intracellular and extracellular fluids. Both of these compartments work in unison with each other. They have different functions that are essential for normal physiological functions, and there's several different principles that are able to control the distribution of water between the various fluid compartments. In the next couple slides, we'll also talk about plasma and the interstitial fluid, but in this slide, we're going to specifically talk about these two because they are play a larger role in the idea behind our bodily fluid compartments. So at the cellular level, we know that the distribution of various fluid compartments in the body is really essential for the maintenance of our health and our survival. So when we look at the idea of the intracellular fluid volume and the extracellular fluid volume, these are the essential volumes of these two compartments and the importance that they hold between keeping these fluids separated. For average, 60% of our total body weight is comprised of water. And when we know this, this means that when we are looking at these two compartments specifically, most of these spaces hold this percentage of our bodily fluids. Like I said, 60% of our total body weight is comprised of water. And so about 2/3 of this is within the intracellular fluid space, and the other 1/3 of the total body water of the extracellular fluid is within this space. And when we look at the idea of the extracellular fluid and the compartment behind it, we see that the interstitial volume and the plasma volume is also within this segment of the extracellular fluid volume. And so this portion is going to be much larger, and I will get into specifics on the next slide about the plasma and interstitial fluid, because the idea is that the extracellular fluid and the compartment that it holds also is comprised of two different spaces, these being the interstitial fluid volume and the plasma volume. And like I said, I'll talk about this in the next slide. And these two also break into about 75 or about 20% of water being held within there. And so it's important to know that these compartments are going to hold different percentages and different amounts of body water, and we're also going to talk about in just a second the importance behind that. To understand the mechanism of these things is super important. We have to understand that the contribution of knowing these principles that they work together is that the distribution of water between these various fluid compartments are essential to ingestion, excretion of water, and electrolytes within our body. We have to be able to maintain and regulate the consistent osmolarity of our total body water and our total body osmolarity in order to redistribute the importance between finding homeostasis in our body fluids. And when we look at the idea of redistribution of water between the two ECF compartments, which we will talk about specifically next slide, we have the idea of looking at forces of water being pushed and pulled onto each other. And so in the next slide, I'll get into more detail about this, but the idea that these relationships hold an importance for the mechanism of how our bodies can maintain and hold these fluids is going to be important for the future and how they continue moving, and I will get into more detail about plasma and interstitial fluid in the next slide. Like I mentioned above, within the extracellular fluid compartment lies the plasma and interstitial fluid. And the plasma is the fluid portion of the blood, and it makes up about 1/5 of the ECF volume. And then we have interstitial fluid, and that fluid lies in the spaces between cells, and it has the ability to make exchanges within cells, and it also represents the other 4/5 of the ECF compartment. And these things are important because although they make up a small portion, they help make up the body's total composition and its importance behind this. And in just a second, I'll get into detail about it. Now that we know a little bit more about the plasma and interstitial fluid and the fact that they live within the extracellular fluid compartment, it's important that we understand the balance between these and the fluids and all that good stuff. So the important thing we need to know is fluid balance is maintained by our ability to regulate the ECF volume and osmolarity. So as we know, and from science, what we discovered, all exchanges of water within the body between the ICF and the external world must come through the ECF. So the ECF serves as an intermediate place between cells and the external environment. When we give the body the ability to add water and bodily fluids, they always enter the ECF first, and the fluid always also leaves the body via the ECF. So the idea behind this is that plasma is the only fluid that can truly be affected, and it's the only fluid that we can act on directly, and we have the ability to control its composition, the ability to control its volume. And so the idea behind this is that we understand that this fluid has the ability to circulate through all our organs and perform homeostatic adjustments. And the ability for this helps maintain the fluid balance within our body. These two factors are truly regulated by the ability for ECF volume and ECF osmolarity to remain under regulation. And so this is in control of sodium and water into the body and the ability of how they're affected. And in just a second, I will continue talking about this. One of the other important things about being able to maintain balance and homeostasis in these body fluids is understanding the components that make up each of these fluids. When we look at plasma, we see sodium, potassium, we see protein anions, we see cations, and we see an bicarbonate reaction that live within these within this plasma. Obviously, the idea of blood and the components that live within our blood. When we look at the interstitial fluid, we also see bicarbonate, we see sodium, we see chlorine, we also see potassium. So very, very similar to plasma, different balances and different amounts, but we do, however, not see protein anions in interstitial fluid because interstitial fluid does not hold proteins like we see in our blood. When we look at our intracellular fluid, we see the importance of minimal sodium and lots of potassium in comparison to plasma and interstitial fluid. And we also see the idea there is a lot of protein anions in this, and there's a lot of different potassium in its forms of how it is transferred into the body. Because it's for skeletal muscle, we know that we need a lot of potassium in order to keep the functioning of our muscles moving. And so the idea behind these components is understanding the also the amounts that are within them, and I will also keep continuing in just a second. Within the body, changes in the intracellular fluid volume results from the direct relation of the osmolarity of the ECF. And so we see things being changed in order to see intracellular fluid and ECF. So there's difference between these two and the disturbances that they cause. ECF osmolarity is increased, and water will flow out of the cell and into the extracellular space in order to help balance our osmotic gradient. However, we are able to do the opposite of this when we're looking at the total body osmolarity and the ability for us to control these bodily fluids within our body. And so the relationship between interstitial fluid and intracellular fluid is actually pretty important. These two components can actually really closely influence each other, and there is a cell membrane that separates them, but the ability for them to diffuse into the cell with waste products coming into the out of the interstitial space is the ability for ions to cross a membrane, and the importance of these either things flowing with passive transport or active transport. And so we see the ability for these things and these components to actually work together to allow water to freely cross the membrane and alter the osmolarity of the ECF. And so this is very important because these things are all working together. This gives a major idea and the components on how these things are working together. And without them, we wouldn't be able to understand how these balances are actually working out in our favor. Oh, sorry. So when we look at the ability to maintain these fluids, they're super important because ECF volume must be closely regulated in order to help us maintain our blood pressure. Being able to maintain our salt balance is very important into our long term of our ECF volume. And so all these little balances and things I've been talking about all work together in order to help these things. And the same goes for ECF osmolarity. These things are closely related in order to help prevent the swelling or either the shrinking of our cells, and what helps overall maintain our water balance. And it's super important in the importance of regulating ECF osmolarity. The control of these things help regulate our blood pressure. They help keep us safe. And in the next slide, I'm actually going to talk about a specific sickness and syndrome that is associated when these bodily fluids and these components are thrown off. And so these components are super important to the ability of working together to maintain these balances and using these sensors, using these aquaporin channels and all these important things in order to understand the influence that these bodily fluids can have if they are thrown off. And in the next slide, I will go into more detail about the specific syndrome. Now that we know the importance of bodily fluids and the components and compartments of these different sections, we are now going to talk about specifically a syndrome and a problem that occurs when we see these bodily fluid and our homeostasis within it being thrown off. So I'm going to talk about the syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone. And so we know ADH to be something that's very important. It helps control a lot of different things. And this specific syndrome is diagnosed when an incessant amount of ADH is released into the body via the vasopressin receptor from our pituitary gland. These receptors that cause this syndrome are in a constant state of overproducing this ADH hormone when it's not needed. This results in the condition of SIADH. This condition affects our urinary system, and it serves to affect the amount of water that is normally expelled from our bodies when we go to the bathroom or when we're urinating. So instead of getting rid of the normal amount of water that is in our body, the water is instead retained within our body. And so ADH help controls how our aquaporin 2 water channels have the ability to absorb water down our concentration gradient. When the water is absorbed, these channels are then removed. These osmoreceptors, is the aquaporin 2 channels, are extremely sensitive. So when ADH is being produced like this and is in a constant state of being on and overproduced, these channels are sensing these tiny changes in volumes within the body. And so this excess water is being absorbed, and it keeps our blood volume high or even normal. And so sometimes it can hide from within our body. But this overall symptom leads to a huge effect on the bladder and a decreased ability to urinate, and instead the retention of water. And in just a second, I'm going to get more into this idea of the syndrome. In a study, in an article I'm going to read to you and talk about today, they talk about the syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone and its ability and its effects on the body. And specifically, I'm going to just begin talking about the causes that they talked about that can happen. And it's pretty sad because there's not one direct correlation when we look at this article. There's so many tumors that are associated with SIADH and infectious diseases. There's disorders of our nervous system. There's different drugs. And then there's all these random causes, mutations of the V2R receptor, the vasopressin 2 receptor in our body. There's also, we see our respiratory tract being affected. We can see infections, tuberculosis. We can see super small syndromes that can affect this. Different drugs, antidepressants, and the ability for all these things to affect it are actually really important. The idea of SIADH is to increase the concentration of our body water due to an unamused amount of water intake. And so we are seeing that these aquaporin channels in the expression of our V2R or vasopressin 2 receptor binding capacity being affected. And so in some cases, when these things can be downregulated, that our article talked about the ability to affect the binding capacity on this V2R receptor and the reduction of the kidney aquaporin 2 expression helps actually normalize and try to increase the ability for our bodies to figure out our homeostasis, to return to normal urine volume and renal water loss. And so this is important because we want to try to find an effect. We want to be able to fix this, and this condition is related in the severity of rapid onset and acute loss of our ability to understand this retention of water. And when we can't fix this, it causes severe issues, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. In this study, they talked about the clinical manifestation and the ability behind what makes each case different when people have this condition, this syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone. And this comes along with the idea of the severity of the hypotremia and the rapid onset of this and the form that it takes on our bodies. And so this study specifically talked about when this condition comes on super rapidly, sometimes it affects the brain so much that it cannot fix it. Symptoms affect the brain and their ability to get rid of the excessive quantity of water from the extracellular and intercellular space following the osmotic gradient and causing a cerebral edema is what this study talked about. And in this case, it has the ability to exceed skull capacity and cause our brain to expand. And this actually leads to respiratory arrest and our vascular cerebral injury. And so in this study, it's really sad because they talked about the specific being, the brain being so overwhelmed with this condition that it didn't have time to adjust to it. And so it literally talked about when hypotremia develops quickly, the brain doesn't have time to readjust to its hypotonic environment. And so in rare cases, if the patient survives in these series of problems, the brain eventually kind of tries to figure out how to displace the solutes, how to try to form and figure out the brain volumes and the ability to get rid of this very chronic problem at the same time. Although they can't get rid of the water retention severely, they can help try to regulate it and try to keep the brain from being harmed in some ways. And so it's important that we understand that this condition comes on in some cases where we just can't control it. And in this study, it was interesting to see how it looms over any scenario, and the major cause of it is the idea of non-malignant or malignant settings. And so we have the ability to look at these things and try to understand why they're happening, and we are trying to address problems within treatments and treatment plans within this syndrome. And so the syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone is very complicated because it's not just one thing. And in this specific example, I talked about the brain, and I talked about the ability for our bodies to maybe downregulate those mechanisms of the V2 receptor and the overexpression. And being able to stop this may be able to help us from being overwhelmed. But because it manifests in so many different ways, we're still trying to find an effective treatment plan. So I hope you like this presentation today, and we really need to understand that the ability to control the fluid within our body is super important because our osmoreceptors are super sensitive, and the ability to help control this is going to be what helps keep these things under check. So thank you for listening today, and I hope you enjoyed it.